Hello, everybody, and welcome to this RUSI webinar on the foreign and security policy challenges for the next President of the United States. I'm rather hoping you can hear me, and if somebody doesn't say that they can't, I will just crack on. My name is Peter Westmacott. I was some years ago British Ambassador to the United States, and for many years I was a member of the UK Diplomatic Service. And I now do a number of other things, and I've been asked if I would chair this little panel. We know, especially those of us who've been looking at the presidential debates and listening to some of the media, that this has been a presidential campaign like no other. We have seen language, we have seen lies, we have seen absurd remarks about individuals in this campaign, and we have seen what Joe Biden calls unpresidential behavior of a kind that is unfamiliar, I think we can say, with those of us who watch US politics. It is a campaign and it's election on the 3rd of November where there's probably more at stake than there has been for many, many years, certainly since the last presidential election of the United States of America. And the result of both that and I think of the congressional elections are of enormous consequence to the rest of the world and anybody who cares about America, both domestically and of its international standing. I think I would just add that whatever people might think of the quality of the debate and whatever people might think about what's happened in the last 4 years, and it's been pretty polarizing, the reality is that President Trump has put his finger on a number of issues which concern a great number of people, not only in America, but around the world, and they're not going to go away on their own. So this is an important election, and the way that people deal with it afterwards, whoever wins, is going to be of immense importance to us all. So to unpick these issues and to talk a little bit about it and then to answer your question, I got a panel of 3 brilliant people, and it's my honor to introduce them very briefly. First of all, I got Ambassador Steve Mann, whose face I can see right in front of me. He's long been interested in foreign affairs, a career Foreign Service officer for many years. Believe it or not, he opened the first American embassies in Mongolia, Micronesia, and Armenia. And he's also been American ambassador to Turkmenistan. He's got a number of distinguished positions in the academic world, and between 2009 and 2020, so for almost 11 years, he was a senior advisor for ExxonMobil. And he's got a lot to say about what's going to be happening on the Republican side of the divide. I should add he's not a member of any Trump campaign, but he is well versed in Republican politics. Then there's Amy Pope, who is a member of the Biden campaign, whom I knew when I had the privilege of being in Washington. She was a Deputy Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, and therefore knows Vice President Biden well. In that capacity, she worked on a lot of very important and topical issues, countering violent extremism, promoting refugee settlement, and dealing with issues like the Zika and Ebola outbreaks, which is pretty good training for what we're going through now with COVID-19. Currently, she's a partner at a British law firm called Schillings, where she advises on corporate and affairs and mitigating crisis. And she's got a background of legal work with the US Department of Justice and as counsel in the United States Senate. Like me, she has the privilege of being affiliated with both the Atlantic Council in Washington and with Chatham House here in London. And then Mark Landler, who is the extremely distinguished London Bureau Chief of the New York Times, highly experienced journalist. I can hardly tell you how many different countries he's reported from, but at the last count it was 70. And he has been the Bureau Chief for the New York Times over the years in Hong Kong, in Frankfurt, and in Washington. He spent almost 8 years covering the White House before he was moved on a big promotion to be Bureau Chief here in the United Kingdom of the New York Times in London. And he's the author of a book called Alter Egos, which, surprise, surprise, looked at the rather complicated relationship that existed between President Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. So with those 3 experts, I think we're lined up for an interesting conversation. I very much hope so. Welcome again to you all. And without further ado, I'm going to say to Steve, would you like to set the scene for us for a few minutes on how things look like from a Republican perspective in terms of the foreign and security challenges that we'll be facing whoever wins on the 3rd of November?
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Sir Peter, and thanks very much to all the RUSI colleagues for inviting me into this distinguished panel. And there's no shortage of foreign and security policy challenges for a new president, for a continuing president, as there always is. And in looking at a Trump 2 administration and its views on policy, to get a steer on this, I turned to the 2020 Republican foreign policy platform to inform my views. Oh, wait, there isn't a Republican 2020 platform. So that gives us further insight as to what we could look for in a Trump 2 administration. That is, as before, a Trump 2 foreign policy is going to be heavily personalized, centering on the president. It will be transactional. It will be competitive, improvisational, and highly averse to multilateralism. So that's, again, I think these are not great surprises to the audience, but that's a chapeau of what we would be looking at. Now, also to say the obvious, for any president, in 2021, COVID and the economy are going to continue to suck the air out of the policy space. But that said, there are going to be some immediate challenges facing a Trump 2 administration out of the gate. And we have to start with Russia. And it's not any regional behavior by Russia that makes me put this up front, but it's the February 5th expiry of New START. And we have an administration that is profoundly skeptical of arms control. Witness the withdrawal from INF and Open Skies, but we're seeing glimmers of discussions of extension in the press. So it's an interesting watch this space for the administration. And a second Russia factor, covert action, especially any potential electoral interference. That would be a Russia issue thrust on the administration. And we'll see if next week brings any news on that score. The next fast rising issue would be a US-UK free trade agreement. Trump administration, of course, is very forward leaning on this, but this will be a tough one, not just because of substance, but because US Fast Track Trade Promotion Authority expires July 1st. There's a 90-day advance notification requirement. So what that means is the witching hour for an agreement, trade agreement, could be April 2. And then a final fast one out of the gate, which is China. And the Trump administration has rightly placed a heavy emphasis on China in its diplomacy, on trade disputes and agreements, pushback on the South China Sea, tech decoupling. And aligned with this is the domestic importance of China policy. And that's certainly some heartland Trump voters and base. So that brings us around to assessing implementation of the phase 1 deal. China has made very ambitious commitments for purchases of US goods by the end of 2020. And in first half 2021, we'll have the statistics coming in on that. So those are sort of 3 immediate ones. Then we've got some perennials that'll be on the administration scope. Starting with Iran, we can expect a continuation of the so-called maximum pressure tactics, but it still won't get buy-in from Europe, and how much can be achieved before Iranian elections in June. The Middle East is always there for any president. Trump, too, will work to expand its normalization efforts. Broader Middle East peace deal, who wants to bet on that, regardless of election outcome? A point on Afghanistan, which is very interesting, whether Zal Khalilzad's efforts can deliver a lasting agreement there. And 2 final things. One that's much worth mentioning in this context, a foreign policy context, is visas and immigration. And I call everyone's attention to a very interesting article in The Guardian today about a set of shock and awe executive orders that a Trump 2 administration can deploy after a victory. And I class this, of course, with foreign policy issues. And one systemic note, I would say also, and I'm sort of sad to put this in here, that I would expect a continued degradation of of America's diplomatic service in a Trump 2 administration. My old boss, Rex W. Tillerson, was in the forefront of this. It has continued under Pompeo, and it will certainly be on the sights of Trump 2. So in that regard, I would expect the continued center of gravity on policy to be with NSC staff, Oval Office, and that complex of officials around the president. So that's my take on the situation. Eager to hear what Amy and Mark have to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Steve. So that gets us going very handsomely. Thank you. Amy, over to you. What does the other side of the story look like?
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks to RUSI for hosting this really important and timely conversation. I'm not sure that we'll know the outcome in a week's time, but at least we'll have a better sense. So first of all, just to be clear, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the campaign. I think first and foremost, we would expect a President Biden to revert to some of what we have expected of the United States with past presidents. And by the way, this is not specific to a Democratic president or Republican president. This is just specific to American presidents. And that is specifically seeing that there's a role for American leadership with and through multilateralism, engagement with allies, a recommitment to our alliances, and recognizing that the problems of the 21st century are fundamentally transnational problems that require a global solution. So if you just take the ones that the new president will face right out of the gate, COVID, for example, the solution to COVID cannot be found just in the United States. There will be tremendous pressure on President Biden to very quickly get his arms around the COVID crisis, to come up with better testing and tracing, to come up with a system for making sure that PPE is well distributed, and to make sure that we have a way forward that has some coherence and some strategy to it, all of which I think is missing right now. But a President Biden would recognize that the United States is only as safe as its neighbors. So if we intend to have a global economy, if we intend for the United States to continue to be a player, we need to rely on workers from different parts of the world. We need to rely on supply chains from different parts of the world. And so ultimately, building alliances, working and engaging our partners around the world is the way to keep Americans safer. And it's not just COVID, it's also on climate change. I would very, very much expect to see climate change at the forefront of his agenda. Likewise, cyber, recognizing that cyber is a very real and very serious threat that cannot be mitigated alone in the United States. And counterterrorism, recognizing that counterterrorism is not a challenge the United States can take on alone. It needs to be done with its partners. If you look at some of the regional issues that a President Biden will face, I mean, starting with China, I mean, in some ways, I actually don't think there's a huge divide between where President Biden and President Trump view China in terms of its challenges to the United States. Both agree that China has engaged in unfair trade practices and that it is a challenge. It's the challenge to be confronted in the next elections term. But I think they have very different approaches. I think President Biden recognizes that China is building its allegiances around the world, including through development in infrastructure and financial support for countries that don't have other access to it. And I think he recognizes that it's important if the United States is going to get ahead of that challenge, it needs to do so with our partners in Europe, in South Korea, and around the world. Similarly, with the Middle East, there's no question that President Biden is a strong supporter of Israel, but I think we'd see a pretty big step back from the current president's policies. That's not to say that he would move the embassy out of Jerusalem, but he would again recommit to a two-state solution and recognizing that there's no way forward if Israel insists on pursuing this strategy of settlements and annexing parts of the country. Similarly, he wants to end involvement in Yemen. He wants to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for its human rights abuses and really take a step back from this very transactional approach that we've seen with President Trump, where almost nothing matters except for the deal that's happening. Likewise, I'd expect that we'd see more engagement in Latin America, partly because of this immigration issue that Ambassador Mann raised earlier. President Biden recognizes that immigration, when it involves people who are fleeing circumstances, is a symptom of what's happening within countries. And so he's already committed to investing in Central America to improve the situation there, to building partnerships with regional actors there so that we have what's really a root cause solution to the issue of migration. But at the same time, he doesn't see immigration as something to run away from. He sees migration as important to America's strength. He would recommit to resettling refugees. He thinks that's fundamental to our values as Americans. And he thinks that it's critically important to reverse some of the Trump policies on immigration, which have been so harmful to the United States and its image abroad. I'll stop there, and I'm hopeful that we'll talk about some of the other issues as we answer questions. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn to Mark to say perhaps a little bit about the elections and how it looks and what we can and can't be sure of, and perhaps to add his own gloss on some of those foreign policy questions that the others have touched on, if you'd like to do so, Mark. So the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you to Rusi also for having me on such a distinguished panel. I will look forward, rather than 4 years, I'll look forward 10 days. Or perhaps longer, depending on how next week goes, and try to give you a sense for what may play out in this extraordinary election. And you know, for all the cliches that politicians use, that this is the most important election of our lifetimes, we might be able to claim that this is actually the most consequential election in many of our adult lifetimes. There's seemingly so much at stake, and so much about how the election has unfolded has just been once in a lifetime. To conduct an entire election, or most of an election, amid a crippling national pandemic has been an extraordinary thing to watch, and has led to some extraordinary developments which play into how we might see the result. And one of those things is the tremendous embrace of mail-in voting and advance voting. So I just want to start with a couple of numbers, which many of you will have seen in the news. So 70 million Americans have already voted, whether they voted in person in advance or with a mail-in ballot. In Texas, where 8 million people have voted, 90% of the entire total of people who voted in Texas in the 2016 presidential election have already voted, and we're still 6 days away from Election Day. You see some of the similar numbers in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. So what that suggests is that we are going to smash voting participation rates in this election. That would appear on the face of it to be good news for the Democrats and for Vice President Biden, partly because the Biden campaign pushed very hard for in-person advance voting and mail-in voting, and President Trump had generally encouraged his supporters not to vote in advance, to vote on the day. And of course, he's sowed these doubts about the trustworthiness of advance voting. So it would appear on the face of it to be good news for the Democrats, but there is also some suggestion that the Republicans have done a very good job in voter registration in certain key battleground states, one of which is Florida. So I think that people are being rightly cautious about drawing too many quick and easy conclusions from the fact that these mail-in and advance numbers are so high. On the other hand, in places like Texas, you can begin to detect a sense of unease on the part of prognosticators that they actually know what's going on in Texas. I thought it was notable that the Cook Political Report, which is probably one of the most authoritative political blogs, moved Texas from lean Republican to toss-up just in the last couple of hours. And the idea that Texas is a toss-up state in a presidential election is truly an extraordinary development. It's also notable that Kamala Harris has been sent to McAllen, Texas on Friday for an event. So the fact that one of the members of the Democratic ticket is going to Texas in the last week of the election also shows how much has changed. It's also notable as long as we're talking about itineraries, that President Trump has spent most of the last week going to states that he won comfortably in 2016, while Vice President Biden actually spent a day in Georgia, a state that, again, 8 months ago, most Democratic strategists would have told you was out of reach. So the map is being potentially expanded by the Democrats, and the Republicans are being forced to defend places that they probably had hoped they wouldn't have to defend. I just wanted to make a couple of more basic observations about this election, because there's understandably a great deal of post-traumatic stress syndrome on the part of Democrats, and then I suppose a lot of hope on the part of Trump Republicans that they can pull off the unexpected victory this time that the president did in 2016. So just a couple of differences between 2016 and 2020. One is that the vice president's polling advantage over the president has not actually changed much at all for months. And it's also worth remembering that Joe Biden had a high single-digit advantage in national polling over President Trump even before COVID swept through the country. So he's been leading in the polls really from the very start. And in fact, when they go back and write the history of the 2020 election, one of the interesting themes will be how stable this race really has been. Normally, presidential elections, there are decisive swings and pivots, and sometimes the candidate's in the lead and mounts a comeback or likewise collapses. We really haven't seen any of that. We've seen President Trump basically rock solid in the low 40s, which sort of equates with his approval rating through his entire presidency, and Vice President Biden in the upper 40s and now trending into 51% in a lot of states. So it's actually, for all the drama, a remarkably undramatic election in terms of trajectory. The other thing that I think is different, and this is important in the final days, is that Vice President Biden simply has a much higher favorability rating than Hillary Clinton did. A lot of people wondered why, if Hillary Clinton was leading in all the polls into the final week, did she manage to lose? And one of the reasons for that was that her margin was always soft because her favorability ratings were always quite poor. Now, Donald Trump's favorability ratings were poor as well. And so that's why the outcome was still quite uncertain in the late stages in 2016. But what's different in this election is that Joe Biden has been really consistently in the high 40s and low 50s in favorability. And that is a high mountain for President Trump to climb. He's not going up against a polarizing or unpopular opponent. He's going against an opponent who actually has broad, if not passionate appeal, which he clearly does not. He does have quite broad appeal. The other thing that I think is different in this final week is that the undecided vote is roughly half in most states of where it was in the final weeks of October 2016. So very few people have yet to make up their mind. It's sort of about 3 to 4%, depending on which state, which gives, again, President Trump less room to benefit from a last-minute swing in his favor. There's also no significant third-party figure in this election. Remember, we tend to forget, but Jill Stein and the Green Party actually siphoned off critical votes from Hillary Clinton in those upper Midwest battleground states in 2016. There's no candidate who's really consistently drawing more than a percentage point or two in the independent category. So this election, I think, it probably lends itself to fewer of those kinds of surprises. Now, that isn't to say that there couldn't be a surprise in this massive advance vote. There couldn't be some kind of large youth vote that we hadn't accounted for. But in terms of the things that the known unknowns of this election, I think there may be fewer. Just to talk about what to expect next week, I think it's right for us all to be very cautious about having any kind of a definitive result on election night. I'd be surprised if we did. But there might be some interesting harbingers of the ultimate result, depending on how things play out. The two of the critical battleground states, Arizona and Florida, both require all mail-in ballots to be received on election day, not just postmarked by election day. And they have committed to counting most, if not all, of those ballots by election night. So if they deliver on that promise, and Florida, of course, has a mixed record in this regard, we may remember from 2000. But if they are able to deliver on this, we could have a pretty good idea by the end of election night whether Joe Biden or Donald Trump are prevailing in Arizona or Florida. Now, if it's Donald Trump, that leaves us kind of in a state of indecision, because Donald Trump can win Florida and Arizona and still lose the election if he doesn't manage to hold on to the 3 states in the Midwest that he won in 2016. If, however, Biden wins in Florida and Arizona, that would be a very strong sign that Biden's going to win this election because he's polling more close to Donald Trump in Arizona and Florida than he is in the upper Midwest. So if by 11 p.m. or midnight Eastern time, people feel confident in calling Florida and Arizona for Biden, I think we might have a sense that things are not going in Donald Trump's direction. The last thing that I'll mention, because it's something all of you are no doubt thinking about, is what happens in the case of disputed ballots. And we got some very interesting, although conflicting evidence of the role that the courts might play in a contested scenario this week in a pair of Supreme Court rulings. In one ruling, which was a 4-3 ruling, the Supreme Court allowed Pennsylvania to continue to count ballots that were received up to 3 days after Election Day. That's something that the Republicans had tried to stop. Democrats were obviously pushing for. It's a Democratic governor and attorney general in that state, and the court backed the Pennsylvania authorities. So that's good news for Biden. However, we got bad news in Wisconsin, where a similar effort drew a different Supreme Court ruling, a ruling that said that Wisconsin authorities could not continue to count ballots. I think it was in that case for 7 days after Election Day. And what was interesting about that ruling was a concurring opinion written by Justice Brett Kavanaugh, Trump appointee, in which Justice Kavanaugh appeared to accept some of the same rhetoric that President Trump has been using out on the campaign trail about the need for us to have certainty on Election Day. President Trump's argument has been, we need to know who won on election night. We can't extend this. The longer we do, we open it up to possibilities of fraud, of rigged ballots, of lost ballots. And so we need certainty. Brett Kavanaugh, in this concurring opinion, talked about the fact that any election that dragged on past Election Day could lead to feelings of a rigged vote and a lot of voter unrest. So it appeared on the face of it that he is at least sympathetic to some of the arguments that Donald Trump has been making. And that for Democrats is a troubling sign. I mean, you of course, recall that one of the reasons that the president was so intent to get his nominee, Amy Coney Barrett, on the Supreme Court by Election Day was he wanted to have a full bench of justices to hear any contested case that goes to the Supreme Court regarding the election. So to the extent that that was a early sign of things to come, that was somewhat troubling. So I think I'll leave it there. There's much more we can talk about, but that gives you a bit of a laydown on the election. Back to you, Peter.
Mark, thanks so much. Thank you all for those tremendous introductions. Questions are coming in, and just to remind people, feel free to carry on putting them in under the Q&A function. I'm going to do a little bit of trying to put questions together, otherwise a lot of people are going to be very disappointed. So first of all, I bunch a couple of questions from James in London, which is first of all saying that there seems to be in the United States a pronounced and dangerous schism in the country, a bit more isolation from the rest of the world, and a fear of China. Does this mean that some of the awkward squad, and he has in mind China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, maybe Turkey, might decide that they can upend the rules-based world? And have we got leadership coming in the future in the United States, which will be able to deal with that? And a second, if you like, related to that question, is that given that democracy and our institutions in many Western countries has been so knocked aside by COVID, have we got the political will, have we got the capability, have we got the interest in addressing some of these international questions to try to ensure that they don't get out of hand? And then there's a last one, which comes from Mike Gapes, former Member of Parliament. Hello, Mike. What about the future of NATO? Would a second Trump term mean that the United States would withdraw from NATO? A question we've been looking at in the past. And he would like to know whether that is a real danger. So two sets of questions there, which I would like to put out to you. Maybe, Steve, I can ask you to have a first crack at those. You're on mute.
Yes, thanks very much, Peter. For the first overarching set of questions, it's a mixed picture with the Trump administration. On the one hand, Trump and his administration have not been shy about confronting what it sees as misbehavior and illiberalism and aggression on the part of China, on the part of Iran, illiberalism in Venezuela, etc. But the line is drawn again at a multilateral response. We're just not seeing that from this administration. We cannot expect it. And frankly, it's also been a bit selective in terms of sometimes exempting Russia, sometimes indicting Russia. If there is a Trump 2 administration, you are not going to have an obeisance to a rules-based international order. I think it will continue to view things through bilateral prisms and deal making. Now, just a conservative footnote, if I might interject it, how effective has this rules-based order been at critical points over the past few decades? And I point us to the recent election to the UN Human Rights Council of China, Cuba, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. So let me turn to NATO. NATO will not be a winner in a Trump 2 term. The Trump administration's view of NATO has been very heavily focused on burden sharing, on the commendable achievement of restructuring national contributions to the NATO budget. But NATO has needed a revitalization for some time. It needs a revitalization from its 2016 Russia policy. And then in general, there's a real question of NATO cohesiveness and NATO aims to be addressed. NATO will not be a winner under a Trump administration.
Thank you. Amy, maybe you got a slightly different take in answer to those questions.
Well, I do agree with Ambassador Mann that NATO will not be a winner under a Trump administration. But I do think, I mean, look, the first question is, do we anticipate these attacks on the democracy and the rules-based order? I think we should. I think they are ongoing and they're continuing, and I think they kind of come in two different ways. There is what I see as more the China model, which is building friends and influence through their infrastructure activities, through financial support to countries, to offering technological capabilities, and putting countries in a hard position of having to choose between the United States and China, which is not a tenable position. And so I think Biden would try to take that decision from such a binary decision and build relationships with like-minded countries, so that it's not a either or, but more of a comprehensive alliance of countries that are working on a more strategic point of view. There's also the what I see as the Russia model, which is the straight up use compromise against your political adversaries, interfere in the election, both through cyber interference, through cyber infrastructure interference, as well as use of tools like Facebook and Twitter, YouTube, and other social media. And both of these, I think, will continue no matter who is president. What I do see, though, is again, with a Biden presidency, taking on that issue much more concretely, pushing back on it. One of the issues that's really fallen by the wayside is the development of cyber norms. What is the appropriate criteria? And what are the appropriate reactions when a country uses cyber means to interfere in elections, for example? That I would see something that the Biden administration would take up and push forward again. And likewise, coming up with a much more comprehensive approach to pushing back on Russian interference, not just in the US elections, but in other countries as well. I mean, in terms of whether there's political will to take on these issues in the middle of the COVID crisis and economic recovery, of course that comes first. But I think the primary difference between a Trump presidency and a Biden presidency is that Biden, I would fully expect, is going to appoint a number of Senate confirmed actors who can speak and negotiate on behalf of the US government. And that's what we've really seen lacking in the Trump administration. So many of the agencies don't have Senate confirmed actors. So many of the agencies are just not staffed in the way that you would expect, especially on foreign policy. So that means you don't have the army of US officials, diplomatic officials, who are engaging and negotiating on behalf of the United States, while there is a separate part of the government really focused on managing the domestic issues. And so I do think that we'll have the political will. A President Biden would be very focused on foreign policy issues. He's had a long commitment to foreign policy. As you know, he served as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as had the portfolio for a number of foreign policy issues while he was vice president. So I don't anticipate that that would really fall by the wayside, even if his primary focus is COVID and the US economy.
Thank you both. There are a few other questions on foreign policy issues, including one or two about China. But before coming to those, I want to throw the ball back to Mark and ask him to have a go at a question from Deborah Bronnett, who asks, if Joe Biden wins, what do you think are the good and the bad implications for UK interests?
Well, the good implications go back to what Amy was saying at the beginning about his instinct to be a multilateralist, and so he is a transatlantic thinker by nature, and he will certainly value the special relationship. I think that at some level it's easier. This may seem like a contrarian opinion given a lot of the press coverage recently about the US election in the UK, but at some level it's easier for the UK government to deal with a normal American president. And a good example of where that would come into play is if in a Trump 2 administration, as Stephen said, that the future of NATO is very much in doubt, you could envision a very painful confrontation between the United States and the UK over NATO should Trump decide to pull out of the alliance. So that would not happen. On the more challenging side of the ledger, it's right, as Steve said earlier, that a trade agreement between the US and the UK would not be as high a priority. Time in any event may be running out for that. I'm also somewhat skeptical even beyond the timing, that the Biden administration is all that interested in a traditional FTA with the United Kingdom. I think their focus will primarily be on the European Union for the early months of the administration. I actually be happy to talk about this more later. I wonder whether the Biden administration wouldn't rethink trade in a more thorough way, and that traditional FTAs might not be such a big priority for the next administration. I think the other key wild card here is the role of Northern Ireland in the ongoing Brexit negotiations. The Internal Market Act, which the Parliament is pushing through, which could rewrite the portions of the withdrawal agreement that deal with Northern Ireland, have already sounded alarms in Washington among congressional Democrats. Nancy Pelosi and Richie Neal of the House Ways and Means Committee are huge defenders of the interests of Ireland and the preservation of the Good Friday Agreement. Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, I think has already gotten an earful on this subject on his last visit to Washington. And Joe Biden has tweeted that the UK should not expect a free trade agreement with the United States if the Good Friday Agreement is sacrificed in Brexit. I think that the UK government is now well aware of this issue, and I would imagine that they won't do something rash in this regard. But I think that that what it does capture is that Boris Johnson will be in a different position. Biden is opposed to Brexit. He said he would have voted against it if he was a member of the British Parliament. And so having a president who does not only not endorse your major project, but is an open skeptic about it, does put the UK in a somewhat different position. So I think the relationship doesn't need to be bad, but the UK government needs to move carefully and understand what the points of sensitivity are.
Thank you, Mark. That sounds right to me. I want to go back to China for a moment before we return to the subject of trade. And I think there will be a lot of people who'd like to hear a little bit more about US-UK trade and FTA prospects, and what real difference it'll make to US-UK trade if there is an FTA, or whether we can just carry on without one in the event that the UK either does a deal with the European Union before the end of the year or doesn't. But in the meantime, I've got a couple of questions. One says, would there be a different policy from the United States towards Taiwan, partly in the light of some of the firmer language which President Trump has used, and wondering how things would be handled in the future? And related question, what about Hong Kong and China? How will the two possible future presidents of the United States deal with that issue in the future? And will the attitude towards China in general be one of confrontation, name-calling, or will it be calmer discussion? Will there be sanctions, or will there be a hybrid approach? So I'd love your thoughts, those of you who feel you've got something to say about China handling, on both the issues and the tactics of China handling for the next president. So maybe Steve, would you like to have a go at that?
Just briefly, because what you see now is what you will get in the future. President Trump has just done $4 billion in arms sales to Taiwan. That's a fact on the ground that indicates the administration's view of Taiwan relations. On China, again, back to the issue of being transactional. To this president, what matters are trade numbers that affect his base, and indicators such as trade deficits, even though those are imperfect indicators. My gut feel on this is that if there is a satisfactory outcome on trade balances and agreements with China, that will go a long way towards ameliorating political strains. But let me turn to Amy for changes under a Biden presidency.
Amy.
I'd imagine that, I mean, look, in some ways there are going to be similarities, but I think the approach is going to be more of a hybrid approach. believe that President Biden recognizes the importance of working with China on a number of issues, including that involving North Korea. But at the same time, would be very worried about the influence of China in places like Hong Kong and its national security law. The vice president has spoken out already several times about his concerns about the way China is implementing the national security law in Hong Kong, and has spoken about support that the United States would give to dissidents who are fleeing Hong Kong because of that oppression. So I'd imagine that human rights would play a much, much bigger issue than it plays right now. And we'd see, for example, the vice president has spoken out in favor of the democratic measures that we've seen with Taiwan. And so we'd see those kinds of overt recognitions of the democratic measures in contrast to the increasingly authoritarian stance taken by China.
Thank you very much. I've got one or two questions about Iran. I'll come back to that. Perhaps we can have a little further discussion, as Mark suggested, about trade. You've all talked a little bit about prospects for an FTA, about the problems of congressional approval, about the fact that fast track agreement will expire if people don't get their skates on. But rather than say, will there, won't there be a deal, and how much of a priority will that be for the respective candidates, and we've done a bit of that. Mark, perhaps you could say a little bit about how important do you think it is for the future of bilateral trade that there is a free trade agreement? Or can things go on pretty much as they are without too much damage if there isn't one?
And you're talking specifically about the UK?
Yes, at this point, the US, the UK, because there's quite a lot of people online who are here in the United Kingdom.
Well, I mean, this is not a trading relationship that is particularly throttled by high tariffs. And, you know, you've probably all seen the estimates for what incremental growth in GDP a US trade agreement would mean for the UK. And I don't remember the number off the top of my head. I seem to think it was like 0.16% of GDP over 7 years. So it's not a transformative thing from an economic point of view. It's symbolically very important, and I think politically important, because it's one of the ways that the government sold Brexit to the British people, which was that Britain would be freed to negotiate its own advantageous deals as a free agent around the world, and this would be one of the first and the most important of those deals. So I think to some extent maybe it's more important politically than it is economically. But I wanted just for a second to get back to what I was saying earlier about Joe Biden and trade. And I draw your attention to an essay that Jake Sullivan and Jennifer Harris, former State Department policy planning person, wrote in Foreign Policy magazine earlier this year, where they really took a whack at the whole notion of the neoliberal foreign economic agenda that has really characterized Republican and Democratic presidents in the post-war era, which was built around the idea that free trade agreements are good. They are primarily about prying open foreign markets for American companies, and that the benefits of that process would flow back to the United States, to the middle class, in the forms of jobs and cheaper goods and greater prosperity. And the argument that they made in that piece was that a lot of the underlying assumptions of those arguments have really fallen into disrepute over the past decade or more. And that Donald Trump actually was correctly diagnosing this. His remedy might have been too crude for people's taste, but that in fact, a lot of these trade deals are not particularly beneficial to the middle class or working class people in the United States. And so they were arguing in this piece that the next administration, Republican or Democrat, might bring a different view to what a trade agreement is really about and what is the purpose of trade. And one of the things they suggested, and that would be extremely controversial, is the idea that maybe the United States should consider a variant of a national industrial policy, not picking in winners and losers the way the Chinese do, but just openly acknowledging that we're engaged in this international economic competition. and that we maybe need our own national champions to compete. And so, I don't know who President Biden's USTR would be. I don't know whether these ideas are going to carry the day. There will no doubt be an internal debate in a new Biden White House about this, and there will probably be strong voices arguing for a more traditional approach to trade. But I would just submit that I think that one of the lessons of the Trump presidency will be a new way of thinking about international economic policy. And we might see those new ideas in a Biden White House as much as we would in a future Republican administration.
Thanks for that reminder, Mark. And if we believe what's in your newspaper and a few others, Jake Sullivan is certainly likely to have quite an important position somewhere in a Biden administration. Amy, do you want to add a gloss to that comment of Mark's about likely trade policy under a Biden administration?
No, but I think Mark is spot on that this is one of the issues where we're going to see kind of a real exchange of ideas within, frankly, it's not just the Biden team, it's within the Democratic Party. I mean, I think this is what Trump has really captured in his successful presidency of 2016, is that Democrats have not behaved as traditional Democrats when it comes to trade policy. And the TPP was one of those issues that really drove a wedge within the party. And I think there's a reckoning coming on these issues that has yet to be determined.
I think also that what Mark was looking again at industrial policy and national champions, I mean, even somebody as laissez-faire in principle as Boris Johnson has been talking about revisiting long supply chains in the aftermath of some of the problems of resilience that have been thrown up by COVID-19, and asking the same sort of questions about the United Kingdom, which was something which, traditionally speaking, a conservative in the United Kingdom would never do. So a lot of stuff is going to be looked at afresh, not least in trade and the related social policy issues. May I turn to Iran on behalf of our guests? A couple of people have said, what do we think is going to happen in the future on Iran? If it is President Biden, is he going to have another crack at recreating the JCPOA or something similar, which would be a nuclear deal negotiated with Iran and perhaps the P5+1, the 6 governments which negotiated it last time, or not? Is there an issue linking to other aspects of Iranian behavior rather than just nuclear capability? And in the event that it is another term for President Trump, are we going to see continuation of maximum pressure? And what would you expect to be the results of that? And I guess that's one for Steve. So Amy, since you've just been speaking, can I ask Steve for a little comment from the Republican perspective?
Yeah, I think you will certainly continue to see maximum pressure that I would say is not really maximum pressure. Because the Trump administration has put very tough sanctions on. It's withdrawn from the JCPOA. It is now creating, in the past few weeks, binding Iranian entities with counterterrorism sanctions, in addition to nuclear-related sanctions, to make it more difficult for a Biden or even a Trump administration to unwind the sanctions in the future. That said, it has shrunk back from complete economic war with Iran. And then the missing part here, I'd say also, is maximum pressure by definition should involve allies. The United States does not have that with regard to Iran, not to mention countries like Russia and China. So I think, again, I'm sorry to be so repetitive here, we have seen what we will get with a Trump administration. And also, and I think it's, Amy just pointed this out, the Trump administration has been excellent, top marks in going for the flaws in existing agreements, whether it's trade agreements, might be JCPOA, the INF agreement. It has been less successful in putting items in place to replace or improve those agreements.
Yeah, thank you. Amy, your thoughts?
And look, Ambassador Mann just really hit the nail on the head. The issue is that despite withdrawing the United States from the JCPOA, President Trump hasn't offered an alternative. And so Vice President Biden has been very critical of the approach because he believes that it has allowed Iran to move forward toward nuclearization in a way that it was not allowed to do under the JCPOA. And so he's pledged publicly to recommit to the JCPOA. Now, whether that's possible, depending on where we are in January, is a real question. I do know, though, that he believes that the answer requires, again, working with our allies. We can't have a situation where the United States is moving forward unilaterally with sanctions, where our European allies, for example, have an opposite policy, which basically would require companies not to impose sanctions for dealing with Iran. And so there's a real tension there, which I think is ultimately destabilizing to the United States and thereby empowering to countries like Iran. And so I would anticipate, it's not that he believes that Iran is not an adversary. He's been very clear about the destabilizing influence that Iran plays in the region, but he thinks that there's currently no plan and that we need to at least recommit to coming up with a plan with our allies.
Thanks, Amy. I was told my fierce instructions were that we had to end at 5. We got a minute to go, but I just want to squeeze in one more question from Tony Lloyd MP. And for anybody who thinks that coronavirus is either a hoax or a nothing at all, I do commend Tony's extraordinary written material about how agonizing it was for him to come through coronavirus. It's great to have him in the group. But Tony says, what can we extrapolate from the election process and the likely outcome about the longer term direction of American politics internationally, domestically, and specifically, what do you think, regardless of, well, not regardless, but separate from the question of who's going to be the president, what do you think is going to happen in Congress? Is there going to be a blue wave? Are we going to have status quo? And does that have a bearing on how America is going to be looking at the rest of the world in the future? Steve, word from you,
Yeah,
and a quick word from Mark, and then finally a quick one from Amy, and hopefully we'll be allowed to run on for another 5 minutes.
Very quickly, what we're seeing with the Trump election and American populism is large parts of America have been fed the notion from both parties about the positive aspects of globalization. They have been told we're going to get a tough and effective immigration policy. There has been it's been called the Davos consensus that just is not working out for large parts of the American population. Any president going forward is going to have to account for this and do some course corrections, whether it's a set of Trump policies or the Jake Sullivan type of piece that has been cited here. So I think there's something afoot in American society that's accurate, honest, and will need to be taken into account in foreign policy.
Thank you. Nice and concise. Mark, your final thought on that, or indeed anything else?
Well, I'll address it more from a purely political point of view. I think that there might well be a blue wave in this election. So we might have, if Biden wins, all three branches under one party, which is, fairly unusual. I do think that, however, both parties are going to face a fairly huge reckoning process. The Democrats, even if they emerge victorious, are setting themselves up for a fairly epic battle between traditional centrists, typified by Joe Biden, and a fairly more radicalized left, probably typified more than anyone by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is going to immediately emerge as one of the future leaders of the party, and in fact may even challenge Chuck Schumer in his next senatorial race. So there's going to be this epic battle, and it will draw on a lot of the economic issues that Steve was just alluding to. The progressives will argue that they've got the better answers for this. On the Republican side, the party will be in the wilderness if they lose for a period of time. And the big question there is whether there's a future for the party beyond the cult of Donald Trump. Trump, if he loses, odds on he will go form a media company and take on Fox. And a certain percentage of the Republican Party will get their news from the Trump network, and which will give him extraordinary residual power to set the agenda and play kingmaker, even if he's living in exile in Mar-a-Lago. So I do think the Republicans will need to decide what is their Trump future? Or are they simply going to be looking at Ivanka as the nominee in 4 years? There are some interesting voices, including some that work for Trump, like Nikki Haley, who will no doubt try to refashion the Republican Party, perhaps bring it back to the vision that people like Jeb Bush had back in 2016. It was not a vision with a great deal of resonance in that environment, but being in the minority for a few years or in the wilderness really focuses people's minds. So I do think that we're in for this tremendously convulsive period for both parties in terms of their long-term direction, regardless of what happens next Tuesday.
I think you make a very good point about where the Trumps will be in the future. We need to remember that for an awful lot of Republicans, he was absolutely not their chosen candidate, but then they all tucked in behind him. Few of them have asked any questions since then. And guess what? Why? Because for an awful lot of Republican candidates, whether it's in the House or the Senate, they need the Trump base to vote for them. And that Trump base at the moment doesn't look like it's going anywhere. Maybe it'll go towards Ivanka, maybe it'll be Don Jr., maybe it'll be Donald Trump having another go, who knows? But I think you make a very good point that Trump, one way or another, is unlikely to be leaving the stage quietly. Amy, your last thoughts in answer to Tony Lloyd's question, if you wouldn't mind, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Well, I think it was captured by the two previous speakers, really, is that Trump is a symptom of an underlying issue that we've seen in the United States over the last decade, if not more. And what I think also we see here in the UK, speaking to an audience here as well, is that this situation where people who've relied on jobs, very, very well-paying unionized jobs, are no longer finding those jobs available. And we have not come up with a system of addressing a situation where they feel like they do not have access to what they believe is the American dream. And so I think that's for both parties to come up with a solution to. Donald Trump has tapped into the sentiment, but he hasn't come up with a solution. And I think that's where the future of both parties is really going to be.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've got to stop now. 5 past. Sorry for going over, and apologies for some of those who've put questions to us, which I haven't been able to get in there. But to my panel, thank you so much. Wonderful contributions. Very much enjoyed being with you as always. And to our listeners, thanks for sticking with us. I see you're dropping off a bit, but there's still 140 of you there. So thank you for that, and I hope you found it a useful hour. Goodbye. Till next time.
Bye.